Hello and welcome to Coin Wars. This is the sixth assignment for Intro to Computer Science, CS161. We are going to program a game in which two players, player one and player two, each have an army of coins that are randomly assigned heads or tails. And the idea of the game is to capture as many of the other players' coins to win. And before programming any game, it's a good idea to learn the rules and play the game a few times. Think about this for games that you may have played in person, like playing Uno for the first time, or playing Crazy Eights, or playing Monopoly. Maybe the rules were kind of awkward to read through at first, and then the first few times that you played it, you were kind of like trying to suss out the rules. And then it wasn't until you played it multiple times that the game started to make sense and the rules become second nature and you get to enjoy the game. The same goes for programming. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the rules together and simulate the game with actual coins. So once again, we have two players, player one, player two. Each player has an army and they also have prisoners. Let's imagine, because we're doing computer science, let's imagine that each player's army is a list. So this would be player one's list, this will be player two's list. Over here is index 0, we have tails. Index 1, heads. Index 2, heads. Index 3, tails. Index 4, tails. It's a list of size 5. And the prisoner list, let's imagine that we also have a separate list. A prisoner list is size 0. There is nothing inside the prisoner's list currently. Now, when people play the game in person, they would flip each coin so that it randomly lands on heads or tails to get the sequence. For this round, or for this demonstration, let's imagine that I had flipped the coins and they ended up in this sequence of player one having tails, heads, heads, tails, tails, and player two having tails, tails, heads, tails, heads. Okay, so we have our initial setup. Okay, and it's also important to know that the order of the coins in the army and prisoners are important. They must not be rearranged during play unless specified in the rules below. So once again, I'm reading the rules along, learning how to play the game. And another thing to think about, computer science-wise, instead of flipping the coins, you could just use a function of some sort to randomly assign each index in the army heads or tails. And that's how we get our flipping, our randomization. You're used to that. We've used some random functions for a previous assignment. So let's look at the round of play. It says that the players compare the first coins in their armies. So which coin is first? Index 0. So index 0 will be the first coin. Now, if the first coins match, either both players have a heads or a tails, each player puts their first coin at the end of their prisoners. Okay, so let's do that part. So we take a look at index 0 of player 1 and index 0 of player 2. Both have tails, so they put that coin at index 0. They put that at the end of their prisoner list. There's a function or method that you can use to remove the first item of a list, and that would be .pop 0, with the argument 0 meaning the 0th index, and the 0th index is the first index. So player 2 pops off their first coin, and then they add it to the end of their prisoner list. The prisoner list was empty, so when we add to the end, this coin, tails, becomes the value of index 0 of the prisoner list. The same thing happens for player 1. Pop 0, pop the 0th element, and then add it or append it to the end of the prisoner list. Now this coin is at index 0 of player 1's prisoner list. This coin tails is at index 0 of player 2's prisoner list. But there's one more part for when the coins match. So because these coins matched, they move to the prisoner list. But additionally, players with coins still in their army, so both players still have coins in their army list, then put the first remaining coin in their army at the end of their prisoners. So when we popped off tails from player 2, the next coin, tails, is now at index 0. So we are going to pop 0 this coin and append it to the prisoner list. So now we have 2 prisoners for player 2. At index 0 of prisoners, tails. Index 1 of prisoners, tails. And for player 1, their current first coin is heads. So we pop 0 and append that to the player 1 prisoner list. Now let's move these coins down so we have a bit more space. Okay, there we go. Now index 0 of player 2 is heads, index 1 is tails, and index 2 is heads. Index 0, it could get confusing with zeros and ones. Index 0 of player 1's army is heads, index 1 is tails, index 2 is tails. Cool, so this is the army list, this is the prisoner list. This is player 2's army list, this is player 2's prisoner list. Now let's do another round. We compare the first coin of each army. Player 2 has heads, player 1 has heads. So that means they match, and we would do the same thing that we did before again. We pop 0 to remove the first item from the list, and then we append that item to their prisoner list. Player 1 does the same thing. Pop 0, so we remove this first coin, which is heads, and we place it or append it at the end of the prisoner list for player 1. Now let's take another look. Oh, wait, see, I almost skipped a step. I almost skipped a step. Because they matched, we also have to then, after we remove that matching coin and place it into the prisoner list, we also have to take the next coin, regardless of its value, and also place that into the prisoner list. So this coin, which was at index 1 before we had popped the index 0, this coin is now at index 0 because we popped the previous coin from the army list and added it to the prisoner list. So these coins technically slide down. This tails is at index 0. This head is at index 1. So because, once again, we had a magic coin, we also had to remove or pop the next coin, regardless of the value, and append it to the prisoner list. So player 2 just popped their next coin, pop 0, and moved it to the prisoner list. And player 1 will do the same. So this tail is popped and then appended to the prisoner list. Now both players have an army of size 1, and both players have prisoners of size 4. So now let's take a look at the first coin in player 2's army and player 1's army. It looks like player 2 has heads and player 1 has tails. So now we have a mismatch. What do we do if the coins don't match? Well, the rules say if the first coins don't match, heads beats tails. So in this particular round, player 2 has heads, player 1 has tails. Awesome. So what do we do next? The player with heads, player 2, captures the coin of the player with tails and puts the tails and the head at the end of their army in that order. So we take the tails, so we pop tails from player 1, place it at the end of the army, and then we also take player 2's head and we place that at the end of the army. So we popped the first element of player two's army, which was head, and place it at the end. So now the new army for player two is tails, heads. But wait, there is more. After we did that sequence, the player with head then captures any prisoners of the player with tails. So the prisoners for player one, because player one had tails, this is their list. So we will remove every element of that list and place it into player two's army. Let's just make some visual space here by moving the coins over. So we take player two's, sorry, things get confusing. We take player one's prisoners and place them into player two's army. So we can pop off this first prisoner and append to the army, pop the next prisoner, append to the army, pop the next prisoner, append to the army, pop the next player one prisoner and append to the end of player two's army. And then there's one more step. After we have captured player one's prisoners, we then free, well, it's not really free, we then take the prisoners that player two has captured and place them into player two's army. So we remove or pop the first prisoner, append them to the army, the next prisoner, append to the army, pop, append, and now player two has an army of size 10 with tails, heads, heads, tails, tails, heads, tails. Now in this instance, who won? Was it player one or was it player two? Let's take a look. What is the victory condition? At any point, if either player has no army, the game is immediately over. So player one has no army, the game is over. Now, if only one player has an army, that player wins. So player two wins. They have an army of size 10. Otherwise, both players must have no army. All coins must be prisoners. If one player has more head coins than the other imprisoners, that player wins. Otherwise, the game is a tie. So we didn't have to look at the prisoner count for each player because in this case, player two captured all of player one's army and prisoners, and player two won. Now, this example that I showed pretty much aligned with the sample game in the instructions. Some things to think about is think about having a list, an army list for each player, a prisoner list for each player. When you remove the front coin, what function do you use? You use the pop function with the argument 0, which would remove the 0th element from a list. When you want to add to the end of a list, which function do you use? You use append. Append will add an item to the end of a list. Also, just some, I guess it's a language thing. The top of a coin, or the coin that has like a face on it, like a literal face, this side is called heads. The side that doesn't have the face is called tails. But also in computer science, the front of a list is sometimes referred to as the head of the list, and the end of a list is sometimes referred to as the tail of the list. So it could get a little confusing sometimes. You might mix it up if you're thinking about the head as the front of the list, or the head as the value of the coin, or the tail as the end of a list, or tail as the value of a coin. So keep those things in mind. Think about heads versus tails in terms of coins, head versus tail in terms of list. Maybe you might say beginning or end, and think about how you will use functions like pop and append to simulate the capture or removal of soldiers or prisoners in the game. And if you have any questions, contact me or your instructor. And remember your ABCs. Always be coding.